building a ride-sharing platform, you guys have sent over some really, really fascinating articles and research materials and frameworks and sorts of stuff about this. And
Yeah,
honestly, it's a lot more interesting than I thought going into it.
really.
I'm kind of fascinated by all the little details and,
Hmm.
yeah, all the moving pieces. And
Oh, yeah.
I think it'll be really fun to break this down. Think of it like building your own Uber,
Ooh.
but like from scratch. So hopefully by the end of this deep dive, you'll all feel equipped to at least start
Yeah.
architecting such a complex system.
Yeah, it really is like building an entire, like, digital city.
Yeah.
Because you've got all these moving parts users requesting rides, drivers trying to navigate traffic,
Yeah.
payments being processed. I mean, it's a symphony of data and interactions just happening constantly in real time.
Yeah, I love that analogy at Digital City. So, like, when you're building a city, you need a blueprint, right?
Yeah,
So
right.
let's start with that. The sources talk a lot about microservices.
Yeah,
What's the deal with those? Is it really like building with Legos?
it is. Think of each service as like a Lego block with a specific function.
Okay.
You've got your user services handling passenger data. The driver service is keeping track of the driver's location and availability.
So, like,
And then there's a really important one, the ride matching service. That's kind of like the brains of the whole operation. It's figuring out how to connect the riders and drivers based on all kinds of factors.
oh, wow.
And then, of course, you've got trip management overseeing the whole ride, like from the request to the drop-off, making sure everything runs smoothly.
Okay, so it's kind of like breaking down this massive system into smaller chunks,
Precisely.
like more manageable pieces.
Yeah, and each of these services, they can talk to each other either directly,
Mhm.
which we call synchronously, or through a more like asynchronous system, which is kind of like sending messages back and forth.
Yeah, and that's where like the real-time updates come in, right? Like when you see the little car moving on the map.
Exactly. And that's just one example. Think about notifications for ride requests or
Right.
status updates, payment confirmations.
All that stuff.
They all rely on this communication between the services happening behind the scenes all the time.
Cool. So like if I wanted to actually like build this city, what tools would I be using? Like what is the tech stack that makes this possible?
Well, your sources mention using React with TypeScript for the front end,
Okay.
which is a pretty popular choice because React's component-based structure, you can build these reusable UI elements.
Mm-hmm.
And TypeScript helps catch errors like way early on, so your code is just more robust.
Right.
It can handle more. There are other options too. Tons of JavaScript frameworks out there.
Yeah, for sure.
You can find what suits you best and the project.
Yeah,
But your sources mention that one.
right.
Okay, and for the back end, like the brains behind everything.
Yeah, the brains of the operation.
Your sources recommend Node.js again with TypeScript. And it's great for handling those real-time updates we were talking about because it's event-driven.
Mm.
Plus, you get that type safety and consistency that we were talking about, the TypeScript, across your whole project.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got the front end, we've got the back end, but like what about the little things that make it all work together?
Right.
Imagine there's like a ton of stuff going on under the hood.
Absolutely. And that's where APIs and libraries come in,
Yeah.
like as your secret weapon.
Okay.
So think about user authentication, right? Like you don't want to build that from scratch. You don't have to. Services like Auth will just handle that for you. So you can focus on what makes your platform special.
Oh, so I can offload some of the heavy lifting.
Yeah, you got it. And it's not just authentication either.
Okay.
Payments, you can just integrate seamlessly with Stripe's API.
Mm.
You can even use socket.io for the real-time communication, for like those really robust WebSocket connections. It's all about leveraging those tools that are already out there.
That's awesome. That sounds really efficient, especially if I'm just a solo developer trying to put all this together.
Absolutely.
So the sources also mention something called BOSS, backend as a service. What's that all about?
Boss is like having a pre-built city infrastructure.
Oh, okay.
So services like Firebase and Superbase provide all these backend services like right out of the box, authentication, databases, serverless functions.
Wow.
It's all just there, ready to use.
So I can just like get a very basic version of my app up and running without having to build like the entire backend myself.
Exactly. That's the beauty of Boss. Huge time saver, especially early on.
Mm.
Lets you really focus on what makes your platform unique.
That's amazing. Okay, so we've got our Legos, we've got like the building blocks of our app. How do we actually put them together? Like
Right.
how do we get this thing running?
So you're going to want to containerize each service, package it neatly into a Docker container. It's like having each Lego creation in its own little self-contained box ready to be deployed wherever you need it.
I see. So each piece is running kind of on its own.
Precisely. And then for local development, you can use Docker Compose
Okay.
to orchestrate those containers. Think of it like your own personal construction site where you can test and integrate different services easily.
That's helpful. So what about when we're ready to go live, like deploy it out into the world?
That's when things get a little more complex.
Hmm.
You're going to need a container orchestration platform, and the one that everyone uses is Kubernetes. It's the industry standard for handling those large-scale deployments.
Oh, wow. So it's like the city planner for our digital city,
Exactly.
making sure everything's running smoothly.
Exactly. It handles like container deployments, scaling, networking.
Oh, wow.
It's a powerful tool. If you want something a little simpler, there's AWS ECS with Fargate, which gives you a serverless container deployment option. So, a couple different ways to do it.
But how do we manage like all the infrastructure? It seems like there's a lot to keep track of.
Right, and that's where infrastructure as code comes in. Tools like Terraform let you actually define your whole infrastructure in code.
Okay.
So it's repeatable, it's easy to manage. It's like having architectural blueprints for your city.
So it's like I'm automating the process of setting everything up.
You got it. And then with CI/CD pipelines, you can automate like the whole process of building, testing, deploying your code every time you make a change.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It's like having a construction crew that automatically updates your city based on the latest blueprints.
That's incredible. So we've got the building blocks, we've got the tools to put it together, we've got a way to manage it. But what about all the information like flowing through our city, like all that data?
Data, the lifeblood of any modern application.
Yeah.
So first, you've got to visualize the key players, things like your users, your rides, your payments.
Okay.
And then you map out how they all relate to each other with something called an entity relationship diagram, or an ERD.
So it's like a map of like all the key locations in our city.
Precisely. And once you've got that, you can start thinking about how the data flows, how information moves through your system, from the user registering to requesting a ride to getting matched to a driver,
Yeah.
all the way to processing the payment and getting feedback. It's a fascinating journey to follow.
It is. It's like watching a package go through the mail or something.
Exactly. Understanding this flow is crucial to building a really good system. It's the foundation of everything else.
This is already a lot to think about. But
Yeah.
is there anything else we need to consider before we dive deeper into all these different components?
Well, we're talking about building a digital city, so we need to think about how it's going to grow and
Yeah.
scale up in the future.
Right.
Because you don't want your city to be overwhelmed by traffic jams
Yeah.
and like infrastructure issues as more and more people start using it, right?
That's a really good point. So how do we make sure that this ride-sharing system can handle all these like new citizens and all this increased activity?
That's where the idea of scaling comes in.
Okay.
And that's what we'll dive into next. We'll look at handling these traffic surges
Okay.
and ensuring high availability. Lots to explore.
This is already so fascinating. I'm really excited to keep learning.
Great.
Okay, so we like laid out the blueprint for our city. We talked about the tech stack, even touched on managing the infrastructure. But before we jump into scaling, I'm kind of curious about some of these specific technologies. Let's circle back to the front end for a sec.
Okay.
You mentioned React with TypeScript.
Right.
What about state management? The sources mentioned something called Redux Toolkit.
Yeah, Redux Toolkit. It's really popular for managing the state of your React app, especially as it starts to get more complex.
Hmm.
It just gives you this structured way to handle all the data changes that are happening in your app.
Okay.
Imagine like a central control panel where you can track and manage all the information
Yeah.
flowing through your city.
That sounds pretty crucial. But are there any like downsides to using it? Does it add complexity?
Well, it does have a bit of a learning curve, but the benefits usually outweigh that initial effort
Okay.
because it makes your code way more predictable, easier to test, easier to debug. So it's really helpful when you're working with like asynchronous operations, like fetching data from a server, which you'll be doing a lot of in a ride-sharing app.
Right. That makes sense. What about the maps? Like all those beautiful maps we see in these ride-sharing apps. How do we even integrate those?
Yeah, you'll definitely want to use mapping services like Google Maps or Mapbox.
Okay.
They have these APIs and components that let you seamlessly embed interactive maps right in your React application. So all those smooth zoom animations, the ability to calculate routes, display real-time traffic data,
Right.
that's all powered by these services.
That's awesome. Are there any other front-end tools that you think are essential? What about like UI libraries for like slick buttons and menus and stuff?
Oh yeah, absolutely. UI libraries can really speed up development. There's a bunch of great open source ones out there like Material UI and Ant Design.
Okay.
They give you these pre-built components that look good and meet accessibility standards, so you don't have to waste time designing every single button and drop-down menu
Right.
from scratch.
Perfect. Okay, so front end sounds pretty well covered. What about the back end? We talked about Node.js and TypeScript. Are there any specific frameworks that like really stand out for this kind of project?
Yeah, your sources mentioned Express.js and Nest.js.
Okay.
Express.js is more minimalist.
Mm.
It's known for being flexible and lightweight.
Okay.
Think of it like building a custom modern house.
Yeah.
You have a lot of freedom to design it however you want.
Right.
Nest.js, on the other hand, is a little more opinionated,
Okay.
offers a very structured architecture, similar to Angular.
Hmm.
So it's like choosing a pre-designed house. You get that solid foundation and clear guidelines, which can be really helpful for those larger, more complex projects.
Right. So it sounds like there's not like a one-size-fits-all answer when
When
it
it
comes to choosing a
Exactly.
backend framework. It just depends on the complexity of the project and the developer's preference.
Yeah, exactly.
But no matter what we choose, we're going to need to pay attention to data management.
Absolutely. Remember all those APIs and libraries we were talking about?
Yeah.
They're not just for the front end.
Okay.
For example, when you're interacting with your database, using something called an object relational mapper or an ORM can really simplify your code.
Okay, I'm going to need a little more explanation on that one.
Sure.
What exactly is an ORM and why is it so beneficial?
Imagine trying to talk to someone who speaks a completely different language.
Yeah,
It would be pretty challenging, right?
yeah, for sure.
Well, your database and your application code often speak different languages. You see, the database is all about tables, rows, and columns,
Right.
and your application code is object-oriented.
So the ORM acts as like a translator between my code and the database.
Exactly. And a great example of a modern ORM is Prisma, which your sources mentioned.
Okay.
It lets you interact with your database using those familiar object-oriented concepts, so your code's just way cleaner and more efficient.
That sounds really useful. So it's like having a skilled interpreter
Yeah,
who can translate between all the technical jargon of the database and the language that my application speaks.
precisely. That's just one example of how the right tools can just really streamline your development.
Yeah.
Remember, efficiency is key, especially with something as complex as a ride-sharing app.
Right. Okay, let's go back to those APIs and libraries that we were talking about.
Sure.
You mentioned some really powerful tools for authentication, payments, and real-time communication. Can you give me some specific examples?
Absolutely. For authentication, Authn and Firebase authentication are super popular choices.
Okay.
They'll handle user login, password management, even social login integration, all securely and reliably.
So I can basically offload all those like security concerns to a specialized service.
You got it. Saves you a ton of time and effort and lets you focus on those core features.
Right.
And for payment, Stripe is fantastic. Their API is super well documented, easy to integrate, so you can handle credit card payments, subscriptions, even manage refunds, all through Stripe.
Wow.
You don't have to deal with the headache of PCI compliance
Right.
or storing all that sensitive payment info yourself.
That's a huge relief. And then real-time communication, you mentioned socket.io earlier?
Yeah, Socket.io is great for establishing these persistent connections between your server and your client applications.
Okay.
And that's really important for things like real-time location updates,
Yeah.
ride status notifications,
Right.
even chat functionality if you want to add that.
So like when a driver's location changes, socket.io is what makes that information update on my app.
Exactly. It allows for two-way communication, so the server can push data to the client without the client having to constantly ask for it.
That's awesome. Okay, then we've covered a lot. State management, mapping services, APIs, ORMs.
Yeah,
It seems like there are so many tools out there to help us build a really solid ride-sharing app. I am curious about Boss, though. Backend as a service.
Yeah.
We touched on it briefly, but can you tell me a little bit more about how we could use it here?
so Boss can be a game changer, especially for solo devs or small teams.
Okay.
It gives you a whole suite of pre-built back-end services.
Right.
So basically a head start on building your app.
Okay, so instead of setting up my own database and authentication system and all this other backend infrastructure, I
Yeah.
can just use what Boss providers like Firebase or Superbase offer.
Exactly. And it's not just saving time, it's also about the features.
Right?
A lot of these solutions come with serverless functions, cloud storage, real-time databases. Makes it even easier to build those scalable, responsive applications.
That sounds really appealing, but are there any downsides to like relying so heavily on a third-party service? Like what if I need more customization down the line?
That's a great question and something to think about.
Yeah.
Boss solutions offer a lot of convenience
Right.
and speed, but they do have some limitations.
Okay.
You might have less control over the underlying infrastructure. There might be some constraints when it comes to customization.
So it's all about finding that balance
Exactly.
between the convenience of Boss and the flexibility of like building it yourself.
Yeah, it's a trade-off
Right.
that you just have to evaluate.
This is all so insightful. I'm already feeling much more confident about tackling this project, but we still haven't talked about deploying this app. Like, what are the key things to think about when it comes to getting this thing live?
Deployment. That's where our digital city needs to find a physical home
Yeah.
out in the real world.
Right.
Remember those Docker containers we talked about?
Yeah.
Those are going to be our vehicles for delivering this app to the cloud.
So we're taking those self-contained units
Right.
of our app and we're deploying them to servers where they can run
Right.
and people can access them.
Exactly. And for development locally,
Yeah.
Docker Compose is great for orchestrating those containers.
Right.
It lets you define how those containers interact, how they're networked,
Mm,
how they access data.
that's super helpful for testing.
Yeah.
But what about when we want to go to production, like to the real world?
That's where those container orchestration platforms come in,
Okay.
like Kubernetes.
Right.
It's kind of the industry standard for managing those large-scale deployments, especially in cloud environments.
So Kubernetes is like the air traffic control
Yeah.
for our containerized application,
Right.
making sure everything runs smoothly.
Exactly. It handles stuff like container deployment,
Mm-hmm.
scaling,
Okay.
networking, even self-healing,
Oh, wow.
making sure your app can handle those traffic surges and recover from failures gracefully.
That sounds really powerful, but are there like simpler options if Kubernetes is just too overwhelming?
Absolutely. AWS ECS with Fargate gives you that serverless container deployment option.
Okay.
It takes care of a lot of that underlying infrastructure management,
Mm.
makes it easier to get your containers running in the cloud.
Okay, so it sounds like there are a bunch of different approaches
Correct.
to container deployment depending on the complexity of the application
Yeah,
and the developer's comfort level.
precisely. And remember, it's not just about getting those containers up and running. You also need to think about how you're going to manage the infrastructure
Right.
effectively.
Right. Terraform. We
Yeah.
talked about that earlier, but can you explain how it helps with this whole deployment thing?
Imagine you've got this detailed blueprint
Okay.
outlining every aspect of your city's infrastructure.
Yeah.
That's what Terraform is. It lets you define your infrastructure as code.
Hmm.
So it's repeatable, it's version controlled,
Okay.
it's easy to manage.
So instead of manually configuring servers and networks and databases,
Yeah,
I can just write code that does it all for me.
you got it.
Wow.
And that makes it really easy to deploy your application consistently
Hmm.
across different environments, whether it's for development, staging, or production.
That's amazing. Sounds like it can really streamline the process
It does.
and reduce like the risk of errors.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool.
And it works really well with CI/CD pipelines, which we talked about earlier.
Right.
So by integrating Terraform with your CI/CD workflow, you can automate that entire process of provisioning infrastructure,
Okay.
deploying code, running tests.
So with each code change, my infrastructure can be automatically updated and my app can be redeployed, like without me having to do anything.
Exactly. It's beautiful, the power of automation.
That is pretty awesome. Okay, so we've covered front end, back end, APIs, BOSS, containerization, even deployment.
It's a lot.
It is a lot, but it feels like we're just scratching the surface of building a truly like scalable
Right.
and resilient ride-sharing system.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We've laid the groundwork.
Right.
But now it's time to dive into that really fascinating world of scaling.
Okay.
Like, how do we handle those traffic surges
Yeah.
when everyone needs a ride at the same time?
Hmm.
How do we make sure our app stays up even if a server fails? These are the challenges that really make the difference.
I can't wait to learn more. I'm ready to dive into these scaling challenges
Great.
and see what strategies we can use to build a city that can stand the test of time. Okay, so we've covered so much ground in building our ride-sharing system.
Yeah.
We've got the tech stack, we've got a deployment strategy, and I think we have a pretty good understanding of how data flows through the system. But now it's time to face, I think, the real challenge, which is scaling this thing up
Right.
to handle all the demands of a busy digital city. Where do we even start?
Scaling is all about like anticipation and preparation.
Okay.
It's about like envisioning your city growing from a small town
Yeah.
into this like bustling metropolis
Yeah.
and making sure it can handle that growth without any hiccups.
Okay, so we need to think big right from the start,
Exactly.
even if we're starting small.
One approach is to just like adopt this iterative process.
Okay.
Start with like a minimum viable product or an MVP, a simplified version of your app with just the core features.
Okay.
Kind of like starting with a small town center and then gradually expanding outward as your user base grows.
That makes sense. Start small, validate the idea, and then gradually add more features and complexity over time.
Precisely. And as you scale, you've got to consider how you're going to handle those inevitable traffic surges.
Right.
Think like New Year's Eve
Yeah.
or a major sporting event. All of a sudden, everybody needs a ride at the same time.
Right.
Your system needs to be able to handle those peaks in demand
Right.
without crashing.
So how do we prevent our digital city from turning into a chaotic traffic jam during rush hour?
That's where auto-scaling comes in.
Okay.
Cloud providers let you configure your infrastructure to automatically scale up your resources.
Okay.
like adding more servers or containers
Hmm.
as demand increases.
So it's like a smart traffic management system that
Yeah,
adjusts lanes and routes to keep things flowing smoothly?
exactly. And when that surge subsides, it can scale back down.
Okay.
So you save money on resources you don't need.
That's really smart. But scaling isn't just about handling traffic, right? What about making sure that our system stays up and running even if something goes wrong?
Oh, absolutely right. High availability and redundancy are super crucial for any mission-critical application,
Okay.
and rover sharing is definitely no exception.
Yeah.
Think of it like having backup power generators for your city.
Yeah.
If one power source fails, the others can kick in and keep the lights on.
So how do we achieve that kind of resilience in our system?
One common approach is to deploy your application across multiple availability zones.
Okay.
These are like geographically separate data centers within a region.
Mm.
So if one zone has an outage, the others can keep serving those requests.
So we're basically creating a distributed system, spreading our risk across multiple locations.
Exactly. And it doesn't stop there.
Okay.
You want to consider things like database replication,
Right.
load balancing, and failover mechanisms.
Okay.
These are all strategies to make sure your data is safe
Right.
and your app stays accessible,
Mm.
even if you have unexpected failures.
So it's like having a city of multiple power grids and water sources
Right?
and transportation systems to make sure that even if one part fails, the city as a whole can keep functioning.
Precisely. And as your platform expands geographically,
Yeah.
you'll have to think about latency
Okay.
and data localization.
Can you explain those a little bit more?
Yeah, imagine your app is popular in New York
Okay.
and London.
Yeah.
You don't want users in London to have a bad experience
Right.
because their requests are going all the way to servers in New York.
That makes sense. How do we fix that?
You deploy your application closer to your users,
Hmm.
maybe even in multiple regions around the world.
Okay.
It's like having these satellite cities that we were talking about, all interconnected with high-speed transportation.
So global expansion requires a global infrastructure strategy.
Exactly. And in the midst of all this scaling and optimization, we can't forget about the costs.
Right, of course.
Cloud services can get expensive, especially as your usage grows.
Right, we don't want to bankrupt our ride-sharing empire.
Exactly.
So how do we keep those costs under control?
It's all about smart choices
Okay.
and optimizing your resource allocation. Cloud providers offer a lot of different pricing models,
Hmm.
like pay-as-you-go or reserved instances.
So it's like negotiating with our utility companies
Yeah.
and infrastructure providers to make sure we're getting the best deal.
Exactly. And just like a city needs good waste management,
Hmm.
our system needs efficient data management.
Okay.
As your data grows, you might think about sharding,
Okay.
which means dividing your data into smaller chunks
Okay.
and distributing it across multiple databases.
It's like sorting our city's waste
Yeah,
into different categories for processing.
precisely. And for those data-intensive operations
Yeah.
like analyzing ride patterns,
Mm.
predicting demand,
Okay.
you might use asynchronous processing and message queues.
So it's all about finding the right tools and techniques to manage that ever-growing volume of data.
Exactly. But with all this technical talk about scaling and optimization,
Yeah.
let's not forget the human element.
Right.
We're building this for people.
Right, of course.
That means providing a personalized and enjoyable experience.
Absolutely. After all, it's the people that make this digital city come alive.
Precisely. Imagine using data and machine learning to suggest, like, personalized ride options,
Mm.
predict arrival times more accurately,
Okay.
even offer tailored recommendations for places to go along the way.
It's like having a city concierge that knows your preferences
Yeah,
and can curate the perfect trip for you.
exactly. And as our city continues to evolve,
Hmm.
we need to stay agile
Okay.
and adaptable. New technologies will pop up.
Right.
User expectations will change.
Yeah.
Competition will heat up.
Right.
It's all about continuously monitoring our system, gathering feedback, and iterating on our design.
So we need to build a system that can evolve and adapt.
Exactly.
Just like a real city.
Precisely. And that's what makes building a platform like this so fascinating.
Yeah.
It's a continuous journey of innovation and improvement.
This has been a really insightful deep dive.
Yeah, it has.
We went from the blueprint of our ride-sharing city to the complexities of scaling it up for a global audience. What does this all mean for our listener who's just starting out?
It means building something like this
Mm.
is more than just about the tech.
Okay.
It's about understanding that big picture,
Right.
anticipating the challenges, and being strategic
Yeah.
about scaling and growth.
And it's about never losing sight of the people
Right.
who are using the platform.
Absolutely. Before we wrap up,
Okay.
here's something for you all to think about. How would you personalize the ride-sharing experience even further?
Mm.
How would you create a truly unique and memorable journey for every passenger? Think beyond just getting from point A to point B. Think about the whole experience,
Right.
from booking the ride to arriving at your destination.
That's a really great question to leave our listener with.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that innovation never stops.
Right.
And there's always room for creativity
Absolutely.
and improvement.
And with that,
Yeah.
we've come to the end of our deep dive into building a ride-sharing system.
Yeah, this was really awesome.
Glad you enjoyed it.
Hopefully this was valuable and inspiring for y'all. Remember, even the most complex systems are built one step at a time.
Right.
So start small,
Yeah.
iterate,
Keep learning.
never stop learning. Who knows, maybe one day we'll be talking about your amazing platform on the show.
That would be great.
All right, until then,
Yeah.
happy coding.
Happy coding. 2.